If you have a Bible and you like to follow along, please turn in it to the 16th chapter of Luke. This is where we'll be spending our time today. This is one of the texts, and of course there are lots of them, but this is just one of them, that in my view is a really hard text. Not only is what Jesus is saying here hard, but it's a hard text to figure out. I mean, it's almost cryptic in the way that he does this, because the examples that he uses to make the point are practically criminals, and yet he uses them to make a point. We're all trying to live, I hope we are, trying to live in a way that everything in our life in some way is glorifying to God. And yet we still have to live in this world. And part of living in this world has to do with things that sometimes serve our self-interests more than they do serving God. Let's take a look at the text. I'll begin reading in verse 1. Jesus said to his disciples, "There was a rich man whose manager was accused of wasting the rich man's possessions. So the rich man called the manager in and said, what is this I hear about you? Give an account of your management, because I don't think you can be my manager any longer." The manager said to himself, "What am I going to do now? My manager is taking away my job. I'm not strong enough to dig. I'm ashamed to beg. I know what I'll do. When I lose my job here, I'll do something that people will then welcome me into their houses." So he called each one of his master's debtors in, and he asked the first one, he said, "How much do you owe my master?" 800 gallons of oil, the debtor replied. The master said, "Take your bill, sit down quickly, and make out for 400. The next debtor came in and he said, "How much do you owe my master?" 1,000 bushels of wheat, the debtor replied. "Take your bill, make it 800. When the master saw what the manager had done, he commended the dishonest manager because he had acted so shrewdly. The people of this world, Jesus says, are more shrewd in dealing with their own kind than the people of light. I tell you, use worldly wealth to gain friends for yourselves, so that when the wealth is gone, you'll be welcomed into eternal dwellings. Whoever can be trusted with very little can also be trusted with a lot. Whoever's dishonest with very little will be dishonest with a lot. So, if you have not been trustworthy in handling worldly wealth, who will trust you with true riches? If you've not been trustworthy with someone else's property, who will give you property of your own? No servant can serve two masters. Either the servant will hate the one and love the other, or be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and money." Now this is a really hard text to figure out. I don't know how many commentaries I read on this text to just try to come to some realization of what Jesus was getting at myself. And I got to say, even after the study I put into it, I'm not really sure what this whole text means. But I've got some meanings that I've been able to glean from it. Let's look at it for what it is. The first thing about this text that's troublesome is that it almost defies some of the things that Jesus has seemed to have taught elsewhere. It seems like it fights against the Sermon on the Mount just a little bit to me. I mean, in Luke chapter 12, Jesus tells the parable of the rich person who's got the barns and there's so much wealth that he says, "I know what I'll do. I'll build bigger barns to keep the wealth there. And then I'll store it up, and then I'll take my ease." And Jesus says, of course, "You fool, this very night your life is required of you." This poor steward, this text fights against that just a little bit because it's talking about worldly wealth. Think about this poor steward. I don't know if you ever watched, I know our president now used to be a TV star. And he used to have that show, The Apprentice. And you remember, there came a point for some of those people where he just looked at him and he said, "You're fired." Well, that's exactly what happens here to this poor steward. I'll never forget when I was working in a retail store over in Waycross. I've only been fired from a job once, and 2 days later they hired me back. But anyway, I remember walking in after I closed the store at 9 o'clock at night, and the owner of the store looked at me and said, "Give me your keys." Just this wave of hot sweat pops all over my body because I knew exactly what he was driving at. This is it for you, Rip, and you don't have a job. I remember the next 2 days before they hired me back thinking, what am I going to do now? You know, I've got a car, I've got things I've got to pay for. This poor steward's looking at the same thing. He's just been told to clean out his desk. It's a terrible feeling to be fired like that. Terrible. This is a Jewish story, a very Jewish story. This man looks at himself and says, I can't dig. I don't have the body for that, the constitution to dig. And for the Jew, to beg was the worst thing in the world that could possibly happen. So what's he going to do? There are historical business practices that speak into this text. Jews were unable to charge interest by law. This is where this text becomes kind of confusing. And this is where you look at these two people, the steward and the master, and you realize that both of these guys are criminals. They both are. What they would do, since they couldn't charge their fellow Jews interest, what the manager has done here is the manager and the master himself have written bills of debt up that are beyond what the people actually owe. They are. And so it's like G.K. Chesterton says of all of us, there are many angles at which we can fall. There's only one at which we can stand up straight. And so this master has hidden the interest from these loans in the overall picture of the debt. The manager has been embezzling on the basis of the extra interest. That's part of the reason that he's been called in. And so this kind of solves some of the dilemma for me as I read this text and I think, what is Jesus getting at here in talking about these dishonest people and the way in which they're handling money? What's he trying to teach? Well, they're all criminals. These people are criminals. He's using them as an example. The master and the steward and the debtors, they're all devious. They're all conniving some way. The debtors want to pay less. The master wants the money back. And the manager knows that they've overcharged. So when he brings these people in, what you see them paying here is what they actually owed. What they thought they owed was what they owed plus whatever the manager had added to it in order that he could do his embezzlement. So now, look at what's going on. The manager gives them this reduced debt, and each one of them now owes the manager something. And this is what Jesus is referring to when he says, gain friends through the use of worldly money so that when the time comes when that money runs out, there'll be people who welcome you into their home. Now, there are several lessons that emerge from this that have little to do with what's actually going on here in the practical realm and have everything to do with what's going on with you and me in the realm of wherein we follow Jesus. The first, do we think as carefully about how we serve God as we do about the things that we like? I don't think we do. I mean, I know I don't. I can tell you, if I want something to happen, if I want to do something really badly, I'll do everything I can to orchestrate my life in such a way that I'm able to do that thing. If it's a hobby, if it's someplace I want to go, if it's something I want to buy, if it's whatever it is, I'll work mentally, I'll do all kinds of mental gymnastics to orchestrate the world in such a way that I'm able to do that thing. Isn't it interesting that we're real shrewd at that sort of thing, but we're not so shrewd in thinking about how could I better live as a believer this day? I mean, all the mental energy that I apply toward trying to get myself into a place where I'm happy with life, I don't apply quite so much mental energy into what it is that would get me to the place where I'm living more in the way that God would have me live. Why couldn't we apply that same ingenuity there? That's part of what's being taught here. The second lesson here is that you can use material possessions to cement real friendships, not false friendships, not party friendships where people are just coming because you've got some money to spend on them and then when the money runs out they all go away. But real friendships, and eternal ones at that. The Jews had a saying that the best barns were the poor and the hungry. That if you had wealth that you and I might have, the best barn to store it in for eternity was the poor and the hungry. Ambrose said the same thing in the 4th century. Eternal barns are poor and hungry children. In other words, whatever wealth we've been given, if we use it that way, we're going to build eternal dwellings with it. I mean, think about this. You and I all have, everybody in this room is middle class. We all are. You know what the middle class is? All that means is we've got time on our hands that we don't have to do something, and we've got disposable income of some kind, even if it's just going to the convenience store to buy a soda. That's disposable income. That's not an essential thing. Well, the Jews were very urgently connected to the idea, and this is what Jesus is referring to, that to take that disposable income and put it toward people who really had need was to build an eternal barn in heaven. That's pretty significant to me. The third lesson is that everything in our life matters before God, no matter how insignificant it is. I mean, if God, He has entrusted all of us with certain things, right? Money, a home, vehicles, assets. We've all been entrusted with it. But if we've been entrusted and we're not trustworthy in the way in which we use those things, then why would we expect that God would trust us with eternal things? I remember talking to someone years ago, and they were frustrated in their life because they really wanted to serve the Lord. They really wanted to be involved in something of a ministry nature beyond just making a living and things like that. And they had some real problems in their life, serious problems with the way in which they lived their life in terms of where their money went. And in having that problem, you have to ask the question, is if I'm being trusted with this money and I'm not trustworthy, then why should I expect that God's going to put me in a position of ministry where I'm being entrusted with eternal things? Think about how significant it is that you and I, when we speak to somebody on the street or anywhere we are about the Lord, we're speaking about eternal things. Imagine, look at the chaos that's caused by anybody who is a luminary in the Christian world, who gets caught out doing something illicit. How much trouble that causes. I mean, you and I then, we spend a lot of time explaining that on their behalf because they've been caught out. Pastors who've embezzled funds. One pastor I read about that didn't pay taxes for 20 years. How do you stand in front of people and talk about the Lord if we can't be honest with the simplest of things? We know we're supposed to pay the taxes, right? So this is part of what Jesus is saying. The money, the assets, life, breath, everything we have is a responsibility to God, not just something that we're able to enjoy. And this is where Jesus closes this whole thing out. Says, look, you might as well just face the facts. We cannot serve both God and wealth. There's an interesting thing here that has to do with the Jewishness of this text. The steward in these cases, in a Jewish setting, in first century Palestine, would have been a slave. This person would have been absolutely indebted to this master in some way. They have no time of their own. They have no clothing of their own. They have no property of their own. Nothing they have other than their breath is permanently theirs. Now, that says something to you and me, because here we are today. And honestly, it's hard for me to think about everything that I have being not permanently mine. But it's not. It's just been loaned to me for a period of time. Everything, including the air I'm breathing, belongs to God. The moments that I spend in thought, they belong to God. Everything belongs to God. And that's why the slave is this example. These people who are listening to Jesus, they would have connected with this right away. We don't, because we just see the steward and we think that this whole text is just telling us about money. It's not. It's telling us about something far bigger. This slave had nothing at all of his or her own that they could call their own. Nothing. Not even their time. Every bit of their time, every bit of every effort, their energy, it all belonged to the master. All of it. That's kind of the way it is for us, but we just don't quite realize it most of the time. I know I don't. I live my life as though most everything I have actually belongs to me. I do. You know, our wealth is going to go somewhere, right? It's going to go somewhere. I mean, if you and I spend a lifetime earning something, and then we leave this world, we're going to leave every bit of it. We all know this. How many funerals have you been to where someone talks about the fact that everything this person has been left right here? It's going to be left here. But while we're here, we have charge over it, just like the steward. And so everything we have becomes something wherein we've been granted not so much a privilege, but a responsibility to use it in such a way that God's ends are served in some way. That should change what we think about in terms of wealth. It's a hard word. But you know what? There are two things about it that, at least for me, give me great encouragement. One is how I use things here is going to show up. When I stand in front of the Lord, everything I did here on this earth, wherein whatever I was given away to something where there was need, it's going to show up. God's going to say, you did good there, Rip. That was good that you did that you offered that. And the second thing is, it's a hard word to learn that everything we have belongs to the Lord, but we are so good at convincing ourselves. Think of it this way. If Jesus were to walk into this room, and I believe he has already, but let's just make it physical. And he walks up to each one of us and puts his hand on our shoulder and says, do you really want to serve me with your life? What are we going to say to him? We're all going to shake our head. Oh, yeah, we really do. And then we look at this text where he says you can't serve two masters. And yet, I know for me, I've become very good at it, serving two masters. I do. I serve two masters very well, all the while convincing myself that I'm really dedicated to serving only one. I don't know the answer to this. I'm just going to be totally honest with you all. I do not know the answer. I do know this, and I think this is part of the answer. I know I'm committed to pray that God would show me what I am to do with that which he has given. Before we get all discouraged, and I don't like to leave a sermon on a discouraging note, think about this for a moment. And this is a place of great rest. It is for me. I don't know how many of you saw the movie. It's 25 or 30 years old. I don't even know when it came out. It came out in the 80s. Called An Officer and a Gentleman. Seen that movie? In it, there you go. Hands went up. Okay, that means we're all about the same age. In that movie, Richard Gere he's joined the Marines. He wants to become an officer. He's in the officer corps training. He's a wild guy. His life doesn't look anything like what you would think a Marine should look like. Totally undisciplined, totally careless. Everything about his life just says, you're not going to make it. His drill sergeant is Louis Gossett Jr., and he is as rigid as they come. And he lays it to Richard Gere, fights with him the whole time. Richard Gere is rebellious against Louis Gossett and all the rules that come along with being a Marine, until finally Louis Gossett threatens him with kicking him out. And they're going to have a boxing match to settle the issue. And so they get in the ring. And at first, Louis Gossett, he's probably 45 or 50 at that point. And here's this young 20-something-year-old in the prime of life. And sure enough, Richard Gere gets the better of him for a long time in this fight. They keep going and going. It looks like Richard Gere's going to whip him. And if Richard Gere wins, he gets to stay in the Marines. Then Louis Gossett Jr., who's been trained in combat and is as hard as a rock, puts him on the ground. And Richard Gere loses the fight. And Richard Gere, I'll never forget this. He looks up at Louis Gossett Jr. He knows that his career in the Marines is over. He looks up at Louis Gossett Jr. and says, I've got nowhere else to go. I've got nowhere else to go. That's the same plea that every person in this room has. We've got nowhere else to go. When I look at a text like this, I am crushed by it because I know that I am serving two masters. I'm serving wealth and I'm serving Jesus. And I'm always torn between the two. Always. Every decision, everything I think about, I look at my bank account. Becky brought my balance home for me yesterday on a piece of paper, and I look at it and just go, I'm constantly thinking that way. I am serving two masters, but I don't want to. But I got nowhere else to go. All I can do is ask Him to heal me of it. Isn't it amazing? Isn't it amazing that God welcomes us that way? We got nowhere else to go. And God says, you just come on in. You come on in. You're with me. Oh man, where would I be without that?